boys and girls, when God gave Israel the promised land, he gave them one important rule to follow. Can you remember what it was? He gave them the instruction that they needed to destroy the idol worshippers who lived in the land. God gave them this command. Do you know why? See if you can figure out why. He gave them this command because he did not want them to be led astray and to worship false gods. But unfortunately, Israel did not obey the Lord. And as God predicted, what happened? They turned away from him and they worshipped the idols of the Canaanites. Now, because Israel had walked away from God, he allowed their enemies to grow strong and to attack Israel so that they would return to God. The idol-worshipping Midianites attacked Israel. They took all their crops and their animals. And when the Israelites cried out to God for help, he sent a prophet to explain to them that they were suffering. Why? Because they had not obeyed God's laws. Now, boys and girls, don't you find it interesting that God then chose one of the weakest men of Israel to save Israel from the Midianites? Do you know that when the Lord appeared to Gideon, he was actually hiding from the Midianites inside a winepress grinding wheat? This didn't sound like a great person to rescue Israel, did it? Would you be happy with that kind of rescuer? Well, we must always remind ourselves that when we read stories in the Bible, even though they are about real people, what lies behind all these people and all these stories in the Bible is our great God. You see, boys and girls, by choosing the weakest man of Israel, God was making sure that everyone would know that it was really God's power that had saved them. On top of that, to begin with, like we said earlier, Gideon had so many men who responded to his call to come and fight that they would have filled an entire rugby stadium with soldiers, all right? With such a large army, what do you think the Israelites would have thought if they'd won, or once they'd won the battle? That's right. They would have thought that they'd won the battle in their own strength without God's help. But you see, boys and girls, God wanted them to know that he was the one who brought the victory in the battle. So that is why God had told Gideon to send most of his soldiers home. That way, all Israel would know that their victory came because of God's strength, not because of the size of their army. So, can you tell me, why did God send most of Gideon's men home? That's right, he wanted Israel to know that he was the one who would bring them victory. Doing a quick quiz. How many men were left after God had sent the others home? How many? 300, that's right. How do you think Gideon must have felt when he arrived with 300 men? Okay, so maybe he was like, oh, okay, God, show me the size army that I need. And maybe he was feeling sort of okay with his army. How do you think he would have felt as he arrived and he saw how big the Midianite army was? They had so many soldiers, it looked like a swarm of locusts. You couldn't even count them. Well, I'm sure at that moment, Gideon must have been thinking, all that Gideon must have been thinking about was all those men that went home, and how round about now it would be kind of useful if they were there with him. Well, boys and girls, even though God had answered all of Gideon's prayers and shown him that he was going to be with him, Gideon still did not trust God. And we can kind of understand why, can't we? But instead of leaving Gideon, God helped his weak faith again by telling Gideon to go and spy on the enemy and hear what they were saying. And Gideon finally realized God would help him. And he did. Boys and girls, we should be so thankful to God for saving Israel and showing them his power by using so few men to defeat the enemy. And will you cling to the fact that if God could do all that he did through Gideon to save Israel, will you remember that he can answer prayers for the things that we need to?